When I first decided I wanted to investigate performance scaling in NVIDIA's current Turing lineup, figuring out which GPUs to include was the easy part. After all, everything from the GTX 1650 to the RTX 2080 Ti was based on the same architecture and had been released within the last 10 months or so. When there were a significant number of requests to do the same kind of testing for AMD, it was a little trickier to figure out which cards to put on the bench. AMD's stack is a little fractured, and they don't offer the same linear progression from the budget cards to the top tier on the same manufacturing node or GPU generation. But we figured it out just fine, and that turned out pretty good. But it's right here today where we'll put it all together and try to think about where Navi might fit in. If you've been searching for that final piece for your show build, look no further than Thermaltake's new water RAM DDR4. The low-profile 3200 speed DIMMs look great in any configuration, but the RGB magic really happens when you attach the included custom water block. Compatible with Thermaltake's extensive RGB ecosystem and Amazon Alexa, water RAM is a true eye-catcher that will make your system stand out from the crowd. So check out the link below to learn more. A quick reminder to you guys that if you enjoy my content, hit that subscribe button down there as well as that notification bell, and consider supporting the channel by buying a t-shirt or a hoodie at the link down below. So because we've already run through both testing methodology and the players involved in this race in fairly exhaustive detail in prior videos, allow me to just recap for you. If you want a little more in-depth talk about these topics, I would recommend starting here, my NVIDIA video that kicked off this series. What I've done is run 13 different GPUs through 9 different gaming benchmarks at 1080p, 1440p, and 2160p. The benchmarks are all run 3 times and then averaged to help try to eliminate outliers. The graphics cards we'll be talking about today are the RX 570, RX 580, RX 590, Vega 56, Vega 64, and Radeon 7 on the red side, and the GTX 1650, GTX 1660, GTX 1660 Ti, RTX 2060, RTX 2070, RTX 2080, and RTX 2080 Ti from Team Green. As we have been performing our calculations and comparison charting by establishing a price and performance baseline and then scaling from there, we will continue to do so here. Generally, I just chose the lowest priced, lowest performing card in each stack and scaled up, showing how performance compares as a percentage of that established baseline. For instance, a fairly simplistic way of looking at it would be if our baseline card scored 60 FPS in one game and GPU 2 scored 120 FPS in the same game, the scaling is 200%. There was some discussion in the comments of the AMD video on which card should serve as the baseline for our combined testing, with options ranging from Intel integrated graphics to a 3DFX Voodoo 2, and if you don't know what that is, you should definitely look it up. But ultimately, the consensus seemed to be that the RX 570 would be the best choice, as it is currently viewed as the price to performance king. I was considering using something like a GTX 970 as the baseline, as they are extremely popular, a lot of people own them and will be looking to upgrade, and they are widely available now for $100 US. But I was convinced that using a GPU several generations removed from relevancy might not be the best idea, so the RX 570 it is. I do want to address one question that seems to keep popping up on these videos. Why do you do your comparisons by using percentage performance scaling instead of just doing something like frames per dollar? The reason is that the initial goal of this series was to show performance scaling across a GPU stack. This means both price scaling and performance scaling compared to something. Yes, a 2070 outperforms a 2060, but by what percentage, and how does that compare to the percentage increase in cost as well? The only way to compare performance as a percentage is to use a consistent baseline. I understand that adding up the number of frames rendered and dividing by the total cost is a useful metric and one that is widely used by a lot of reviewers, and there's nothing wrong with that approach at all. But I think that this type of analysis gives us a more nuanced way to look at the data, especially if we're trying to distill multiple resolutions down into one result. So in the interest of not having to listen to me talk any longer, here is the raw performance data for each GPU involved in our testing. After all the tests were run, I took the 8 benchmarks that return results in frames per second, so that's everything except Firestrike, and averaged the result across each resolution. So each GPU ends up with an average 1080p score, an average 1440p score, and an average 4K score. These charts show what those results look like, and I apologize for not being able to combine everything into one graph for you, but because of the amount of data here, the numbers would just be too small and hard to read if it was all combined. Next up, we can then figure relative performance at each resolution using our RX 570 baseline. What these next charts show is the scaling performance of each GPU compared to the 570, which is assigned a score of 100. For instance, if a card scores 200 here, it would mean it averages exactly twice the amount of frames at that given resolution. You can see that we actually have negative scaling here as well, as the GTX 1650 performs worse than the RX 570 on average. This doesn't bode well for the GTX 1650 moving forward, especially since it does cost more. Next up, we have our price chart, and this one is pretty simple. As with the previous calculation, the RX 570's MSRP at the time of filming is the baseline and is assigned a score of 100. This chart shows you what percentage increase every card in our test might cost you. So, for instance, an RX 580 will cost you 128% of the cost of an RX 570. Things get pretty spendy up at the top of the range here, which will also reflect poorly in our next chart, which is the one that this has all been leading up to. Because we now have both price and performance charted as a scaling percentage against the same baseline, we can now compare everybody all at once on the same graph, and this is what it looks like. I'll just leave this here for a minute and shut my mouth. Now we have to try to figure out where Navi might fit in. Remember, there are 2 SKUs at launch, the RX 5700 and the 5700 XT. The RX 5700 falls right here on our pricing scale, and the RX 5700 XT sits right here. If we draw a line down to the performance metric, we can see what we can refer to as an expected value for performance, given all the data that we have right now. Of course, this is still purely speculative and is based on current price versus performance on the GPUs that are available today. Ideally, we'd like to see both GPUs exceed their correlating performance target, which would indicate a higher generation over generation jump than is expected right now. So that's all for our series on current generation price versus performance and scaling for both NVIDIA and AMD. How will the Navi launch shake things up? Stay tuned to the channel for all the Navi you can stomach, and if you have a specific question you'd like addressed, leave it down below, and I'll do my best to look into it when the cards get here into the office. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.